Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the launch of this initiative. It's lovely to see those of you I can see on my screen, which is clearly not all of you, because we have got a large group of people at this event, which is really heartening. My name's Claire Langhammer. I'm the Director of the Institute for Historical Research, and I work really on 20th century British history, although since moving to the Institute, my horizons have expanded significantly, which has been lovely, and that's included sort of seeing and working with early career researchers who are researching a really interesting range of topics, and different periods. The session this afternoon is going to be recorded. We're recording it so that those who can't be here today for various reasons can see it. It may be that there are parts of it that you wish to revisit later on. So just make you aware of that. We'll be taking questions towards the end of the session, and we'll use the tried and tested methods of Zoom for that. So the raised hand or the question in chat. I'll hand over to Rodri in a second, but I just wanted to say a few words about what this initiative is about, really. I think those of us who are fortunate enough to be at particular career stages within academia and just have a sense of just how hard it is for those not in full-time permanent academic positions, trying to build a career and also trying to make that move from the thesis to the first monograph, sometimes without any institutional support for that. We're also acutely aware of the specific challenges that are faced by some groups of students in the face of deep structural inequalities. I think when we started talking about this initiative, myself and Rodri, we were acutely aware that one very small initiative is like a drop in the ocean of dealing with these structural inequalities. But we do hope that it can sit within a wider framework of initiatives, both at the IHR, within Bloomsbury, and also within the discipline of history more broadly. Gemma will be putting the form in the chat, the way in which you can apply for this initiative. But I'll let Rodri talk you through that later on. And I'm now going to hand over to Rodri, who is Senior Publisher for History at Bloomsbury Publishing, and is going to now open up the session. Thanks, Rodri.
Thanks very much, Claire. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Claire and Gemma and everyone at the IHR for partnering with us on this really important and exciting initiative. It's been the pleasure sort of developing this with Claire, and I'm looking forward to hopefully us establishing this as a long-standing and fruitful collaboration that's sort of, I think, the latest in a long line of kind of collaborations that we've had with the IHR at Bloomsbury, and sort of really pleased to see that relationship continuing. I'd also really like to say thank you to all of you for coming along and listening today to what we have to say, and obviously seeing your interest and willingness to kind of hear a bit more about what we're looking to do is a really important part of kind of like what we're trying to establish with this initiative. And so thank you for taking the time when I know there are many sort of competing priorities for people's time out there, so much appreciated. I think, Claire, in terms of the initiative itself, between what Claire has kind of very eloquently kind of set out so far with regards to the motivations behind the initiative and kind of why we've got together and where we see this fitting into the wider picture when it comes to sort of improving sort of opportunities for people from a wider range of backgrounds. I think between that and obviously hopefully the web page and the information that Gemma will share, that will give you a lot of the kind of the minutiae, the nuts and bolts behind kind of what this process is. So I won't kind of speak at length to that now, and if anyone has any specific questions at the end, then I'm very happy to answer those. Just to say that obviously, and just to reiterate that underlying principle, that motivation that we have for this initiative is that, we're really looking to seek to improve the publishing opportunities that are available for early career historians and researchers from a diverse range of backgrounds in sort of all different contexts. So that's the kind of the very pure and underlying motivation behind this. And I'd like to think that various people that maybe look to try and sort of submit for this initiative and look to kind of be taken into consideration will benefit from being involved with the initiative. Whether they end up getting the completion grant or not, I think there will be, a real kind of widespread kind of impact for, in a positive sense for numerous people that look to try and engage with this initiative and benefit from it. So yeah, I'd like to move on now then, I suppose, to one of the things I suppose that we're trying to offer as a support mechanism for this whole initiative, which is to tell you a little bit more about my experience and my thinking with regards to what can facilitate a very successful conversion from PhD thesis to monograph. It is an art mixed with a science. There are things to consider, and there are pointers and suggestions that I can give you from my experience and from the projects that I've worked on that I think should hopefully prove useful for people, and are things that you can take away and at least mull over then with regards to your own work and how you might be looking to make that jump into kind of a monograph publication. Just to give you a little bit more background about myself, I've been working as a commissioning editor on the history list at Bloomsbury for over 11 years. I worked on a wide range of books for the academic market, from sort of a large number of research monographs, of which many are sort of PhD theses versions. I've also worked on a number of undergraduate student texts, supplementary reading books, reference works, multi-volume reference works, and even a big major digital resource as I sort of crawl into the 21st century as best I can, and as we kind of update our offerings at Bloomsbury. So that's a little bit about kind of my experience in the field, I suppose. So yeah, let's talk about sort of thesis to monograph conversion then in a bit more detail. I'd like to kind of cover a few different areas. I think there's probably 5 different areas that are worth sort of telling you a little bit more about, some of which may appear a bit more obvious than others, but hopefully, it will all be useful, if only as a reminder, if not as kind of completely new kind of ideas and information for you. So obviously the main thing to bear in mind when it comes to this process is that when you're revising your PhD for book publication, it's obviously going to involve, it's necessary to involve some adaptation of the content and the style of your dissertation. We need to remember that it's important that the aims and emphasis of the book need to be that it's what it's doing is an original contribution to scholarly dialogue, rather than trying to prove to somebody that you deserve to be awarded a PhD. So the underlying sort of driving force for what that text is doing is adjusted slightly. You're going on a different pathway. So the primary goal in kind of revising that dissertation needs to be trying to make every element of the manuscript focused, essential, and succinct. So the first kind of area I want to talk about is audience. So it seems obvious, but always try and keep in mind the target audience for your book. Obviously, academic monographs are written for relatively specialist audiences, scholars and advanced students. However, it's important to bear in mind that there could be some crossover interdisciplinary appeal. And it's important to remember, obviously, that the audience for the book might well have wider research interest than your PhD committee. So bear in mind that kind of potential for broader appeal, and make sure the manuscript is as readable as possible throughout. And there's various ways in which you can kind of help to do that, and I'll talk in sort of a bit more detail about that as we go on. The next key area, and it's again, there's not reams and reams to be said about this, because it is just the surface level, is the title. Now, don't feel under pressure to come up with kind of the sort of most mind-blowing title that possible. There's really no expectation around that. And from a publisher's perspective, I'd always encourage people to not to try and reinvent the wheel when it comes to their title, and as I say, not to feel under too much pressure. I'd probably say that the vast majority of projects that we publish don't end up with the same title that they came in the door with. At the very least, there'll be some tweaking, adjusting there. And what we need to remember is, when it comes to academic monographs, although there's always that sort of particularly when something that's a project that's developed from your thesis, that this is your baby, and there's a lot of kind of love and care for it. You want to go with something poetic, or you want to go with something that's got a real flourish to it as a title, and that's great. And I mean, obviously, if you can balance that and find some way of sort of incorporating it whilst also hitting some of the key words, some of the important elements that you need to get out right front and center in that book title, then that's fine. But the key thing when it comes to title is keep it clear, concise, and direct. It essentially needs to, I always think in history, I like to look for what I think of as locators, and that geography, chronology, and theme. You want to know, if a book is on sort of gender politics in Korea in the 19th century, I want to see some of those words in the main title, because for various reasons. I mean, from a kind of a practical, sort of commercial point of view, monographs don't get a lot of airtime, and if people and researchers are looking for work in a particular field, you'll improve your online searchability by having these keywords in the main title. Oftentimes, academic librarians, when they're looking to purchase scholarly monographs, may only see a list of titles, because they have so many projects and publications they need to consider for their buying. There really isn't time or scope for looking at more than that for when it comes to monographs. So if your title is a bit impenetrable and there's no real sense of where the market is or who the audience is, then it can be, you can find yourself losing institutional purchases then as a result. So it really is good for discoverability and trying to reach that initial academic library audience as widely as possible. Moving on then, thinking about structure. So again, without wanting to state the obvious, the structure of the book needs to be clear, logical, easy to navigate. It also needs to reflect the progression of your research and objectives. Think about chapter length. Chapters need to be even, relatively speaking, not overly long. If you think about it, I mean, anytime I feel like a chapter is getting over sort of 10,000, 12,000 words at a push, there's always the risk really that even with subheads, it's going to kind of collapse in on itself a little bit, and the manuscript's kind of going to break down in terms of its momentum. If you find a chapter sort of exceeding that length, you really want to try and take a step back, maybe get some additional sort of thoughts from a colleague or so on, and just think about maybe ways in which you can kind of break that content down into slightly more digestible sort of chunks. Consider revising your table of contents. This is obviously the first thing a reader is going to encounter when they see the book. I mean, table of contents are often, like think of our own website. They're listed when we look to sell a book on our site, and so it's a real big. The content is an advert for your book. It's both the first step into the text itself, and it's also a vital sort of promotional tool in itself, really, to kind of give people a clear sense of what they're going to be getting out of the book, where is it going to be taking them, so again, chapter titles need to be clear, concise, include keywords and names. I think that one thing I notice if I'm being particularly critical of certain PhD theses when they come to me, I mean, I see a tendency sometimes to include long quotations as part of chapter titles, sort of that kind of and I can see why, the appeal of kind of, hanging the chapter off a kind of a key quotation, whether that's from a source or whether it's from a work of art. it's better to try and avoid that, really. I know there's, it can feel like it's adding real sort of color and sort of depth to the content list, but what it does is really it kind of like it makes it more difficult for people to easily kind of access the information they're really looking for, which is what is this book going to be, and what is this book going to be offering me? Where is it taking me from a kind of a scholarly point of view? Think about including a brief introduction, rather than a kind of a long explication of the state of the discipline, and a conclusion as well. I think to sort of shape your MS into a really coherent whole. I mean, there's an element of that being sort of a point of subjectivity, but I mean, I think that from my perspective, I think particularly with the first book, when you're converting a thesis into a monograph, I think bookending it with a kind of a good introduction and a solid conclusion that kind of ties up your arguments just helps to give it that shape and structure to the whole text that it just encourages you to kind of stay on the straight and narrow then throughout the chapters themselves, the main chapters. The bibliography probably needs to be a lot shorter than that of your thesis. Remove any references that aren't strictly necessary. I think Claire and I maybe have touched on this in a previous workshop, sort of rings a bell, and I'm going to talk a little bit about references later. I mean, it's not just the fact that for kind of directness and progression of your own argument that this is a valuable exercise and an important thing to do to kind of prune these things, but it's also from the point of view of a word count. You'll work with, whether it's Bloomsbury or with another academic press, you'll probably be presented with a word count, at contract stage, and why waste the words? It's likely that you'll probably find yourself, I tend to find issues with overlength rather than underlength more, and why kind of hamstring yourself by sort of using too many of your words for the bibliography and the notes when they could be being put to better use in the main argument. Making some cuts there could mean that you come in under the word count and you're able to use that for an extra example in chapter 3, or just making better use of kind of what the the length of material you've been given, basically. So kind of moving on then from sort of structure onto kind of issues that are more sort of content focused. Obviously, the aims and objectives of the overall project need to be central to the narrative throughout. The book, as I said before, essentially needs to be a more succinct and focused version of the dissertation. Only include material that genuinely moves the narrative forward, and sort of keep an eye on your overall arc, your overall story. The main argument needs to be clear and compelling. Essentially, and I think this is one of the things that any project can benefit from when it comes to a proposal. Actually, is you should almost be able to elevate a pitch what your book is offering, what's distinctive about it for the field in 30, 50 words tops, and you should have that like close to hand all the way through the book writing project, basically, because if you ever find yourself kind of and it's easily done, and I can totally see why, midway through chapter 4 and feeling like you've sort of gone a little bit kind of, what you're writing is interesting, but it's maybe not really kind of following that kind of pathway and following that kind of line of inquiry that you set yourself with the text. Just go back to that elevator pitch, go back to that 50-worder, and just think to yourself, right, hang on, how can I make this chapter a bit more consistent with what it is that I'm trying to say with this book? Create and sustain an authorial voice. Your book is your contribution to scholarly debate. It's not an academic requirement, and so the style of your narrative needs to reflect that. There's no reason to kind of feel like you have to find some literary genius, and not everyone is going to write sort of I'll choose my countryman Dylan Thomas here. That's not an expectation, but feel confident in terms of the way you write, and make confident, fluid and clear statements. Avoid the passive voice. Keep that argument fluent, and as I say, going back to that elevator pitch again, if you get the confidence from knowing that you have something to say, and that's the clear trajectory that your book is taking, that the style of the writing and the ease and confidence with which you write will naturally just flow as a result of that. Remove any kind of unessential scholarly materials that are going to clearly identify your manuscript as a PhD thesis. chapters on methodology, literature review. We don't need those in a monograph. Overviews of secondary material and theoretical approach, that all just needs to be integrated into the main text, and only then when necessary, I'd say. There's a lot of that material from your thesis, while it may feel like you're, on one hand, you've done this work and you feel like, oh, I want to sort of somehow get it in. Sometimes less is more, and there's a need to kind of recognize where some of that material is superfluous to what you're doing with this book, and it can be put to one side. Avoid repetitive material. You don't want to be repeating yourself again. It's a waste of words, and it sort of takes the enjoyment out of it for the reader. Remove any lengthy and unnecessary notes. Like I mentioned, a lower level of annotation is expected in books compared to thesis. Really make sure you tame those runaway notes, and it's because too many notes really compromise the readability of a book. Again, same with quotations. Quote judiciously. Make sure all examples keep the book moving forward. We don't need to quote any greater length than is absolutely necessary. Cut the jargon wherever possible, or include explanations in as kind of a sort of smooth a way as possible for a non-specialist audience. Again, going back to that kind of, we're talking to more than the PhD committee here, and you want to try and reach the widest possible audience you can with the book. So you don't want these kind of barriers to your work sort of getting in the way of people's access to what you're trying to say. Refer to this book rather than this thesis, and sort of remove anything really that indicates the origins of the book are derived from a PhD. That includes things like thanking PhD supervisors in a really explicit, obvious way that this is a thesis in your acknowledgements. I mean, there are ways of thanking people, and obviously you can say, I'd like to thank Professor X for her many insightful comments on my manuscript, or something like that. Just something a little bit more sort of subtle, because unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the sort of the reports I get from our sales teams continue, and this has been the case for many years now, is that if you explicitly reveal a book's origins as being from a dissertation, it doesn't really matter how strong that dissertation is. There's a good chance it's going to restrict your sales, and key distribution channels are maybe not going to show it as much attention as it might otherwise get. So it's best to just sort of sadly play the game a little bit there, and just allow your book to have the the sort of the maximum airplay that it can get. And that kind of moves me on to the last sort of point that I wanted to touch on, and it's probably the most important. We've sort of touched on it slightly in different points of what I've said earlier, but it's feedback. It's absolutely vital. I can't stress enough that the best projects are the ones that have been sort of shared with colleagues, spoken about at the dinner table. People have seen chapters, given you feedback. Don't, please, and I can understand again why, but wherever possible, try not to be too precious. Be really positive and proactive when it comes to sort of getting yourself feedback, and whether that's the proposal document or chapters that you're working on. The more kind of sounding boards you can take, the stronger a book will be once it's published. Because once it's out there in the world, sort of, and you're at the mercy of journal reviewers and everyone else, it's hard to take those words back off the page. But the harder you can work, and the more valuable insights you can take from people in the field and related fields, then the stronger it will be. So I can only emphasize that enough really in this presentation, and I think obviously in a kind of hopefully a seamless segue, that's another thing that our initiative will hopefully help to provide for at least shortlisted projects. We will be looking to get people sort of at no cost to them, feedback from people in the field, and that should help to strengthen those projects wherever they end up publishing. So yeah, I think that was kind of essentially everything I wanted to sort of say on the thesis to monograph conversion side of things. And I'm very happy to kind of answer questions about any of that, or anything else about the kind of like the academic publishing process or the initiative, I suppose.
Thank you so much, Rodri. Rodri, there have been a number of, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. There are been a number of kind of questions in the chat. There may be, I think for some people the sound was dipping out a little bit. So if there may be things that people just want a little bit, something just, you know, reinforcing, loud and clear, that suggests I'm probably shouting. Apologies if I am shouting now into your houses. So if I take the questions in the chat, just pull those out for you, Rodri, so you're not trying to do two things at the same time.
That would be super helpful.
Yeah, and then we can open it up, and I'll keep an eye on those, and then people who want to ask their questions themselves are obviously incredibly welcome to do so. The first question that came up concerned the question of word length, and I think it's a really helpful one, because I think that one of the challenges, I mean, certainly if I think back to my own experience, which was decades ago, but I think that sense of needing to demystify is so important, because things that we assume everybody will know, people don't always know. And I think that central question of what should the word count be is a really important one. So maybe you could just say a little bit about that first of all.
Yes, yeah, and apologies if there was say a bit of dropout with the volume. Do somebody wave or shout at me if anything kind of cuts when I'm speaking, and you miss anything that I'm trying to say. Yeah, in terms of word length, I mean, as I say, chapter to chapter, I would say that, you know, anything in excess of sort of 10, 12,000 words, you want to be having a look at that, really, I think, because even with subheads, you know, my feeling is that you know, that starts to become a very lengthy chapter, and then, you know, it may be worth taking a step back from the manuscript at that point and trying to see if there's a way of sort of breaking that content down into slightly more digestible chunks, because I think there is a tendency, once chapters get over that length of, you know, it does make you wonder whether there is some excess there that needs to be trimmed, and maybe there's a more succinct way of kind of driving the narrative forward at that point. I mean, in terms of overall word count, I mean, obviously it kind of varies from publisher to publisher. I mean, we're quite flexible at Bloomsbury in that, you know, I think we've sort of published scholarly monographs on the history list, you know, everything that ranges from, say, about 65,000 words at the very lower end, inclusive of notes and bibliographic material, right the way up now to probably, and this number has come down a little bit, probably a kind of a top end of about 120,000 words, inclusive of notes and bibliography. Anything that goes beyond that, you know, for us becomes slightly problematic, kind of from a kind of a publishing model perspective, and sort of how we set up and our production costs and so on. And different publishers will probably have different thresholds, but I mean, those are kind of, you know, that's kind of our you know, sort of continuum, I suppose. And, you know, I would generally say that the majority of the monographs we tend to publish are probably around the 90,000, 100,000 word mark.
Thanks, Rodri. There's a question about our criteria, which I think is a very good question that that somebody has posed, which is how are we going to define recent PhD students? Is there a cutoff date? I mean, I think shall I answer that, Rodri, or would you like to?
Yeah, very happy for you to answer that one, Joshua.
I mean, I think our sense is that the experience of the last few years with the global pandemic has really changed everything in terms of what is recent and what is not recent, and as has the extended periods of precarity that a lot of early career researchers are experiencing, where they remain recent PhDs in some ways, because not having that necessarily that opportunity to really develop the PhD into the book. So I think from my perspective, certainly, I think it's a fluid category. As long as you're still working, you know, you're in the headspace of translating the PhD into the book. I think that's fine. Rodri, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we go into this with the same spirit, don't we, Claire? Which is essentially, you know, this is meant to be the whole point of this initiative, or one of the underlying sort of elements of it, is that it's inclusive, you know. And I think that we are, you know, we're not interested in putting in a kind of a set in stone figure in terms of, as you said, like somebody must have completed their PhD thesis, no further than 5 years ago or something. I think, as you say, particularly with the pandemic and everything that's happened, I think if somebody thinks that they are suitable for this initiative, and they are, as you say, what the definition of somebody being in the early stages of their academic career, it is kind of a more complex thing than just putting a number on when they finish their PhD. So yeah, I think we're fluid on that front. So if people feel like this is an initiative for them and this is something that they would benefit from, then we're keen to see proposals from people.
Thanks, Audrey. So there's another great question here, which I think is something that can worry a lot of people across career stages, actually. What happens if you publish articles based on your dissertation during the PhD? Is this problematic when turning the thesis into a book?
I'd say not, for a couple of reasons, really. I mean, firstly, sort of tied to a lot of what we've just been talking about, really, which is, while I would expect in a way, I would almost anticipate there being some material that goes into a manuscript, a monograph, that's been kind of, fine-tuned and chopped around, if you like, as part of a journal article or two, and some of that kind of core research and sources that are being used and so on, and points that are being made, are going to be there in some form in those articles. Part of the kind of the refinement process that we're talking about here, from the thesis to monograph, should mean that whatever that content is and how it's being used, it should look quite different anyway. And I also think that just from a kind of a point of view, thinking how much content maybe finds its way into those articles, I would imagine that, say, for to try and kind of conjure up an example, for a kind of 100,000 word book, if you've got kind of 7, 8, 9 chapters, if 2 or 3 of those have appeared in some form or other as journal articles, then that's totally fine. We publish books like that all the time. I mean, if you found yourself in a position where literally, you don't envisage there being a single chapter in the book that hasn't already been published as a journal article elsewhere, then that may be something you'd want to have a conversation with me or whoever the editor is in advance. And there are maybe things that need to be worked out then, in terms of how you can ensure that the book is adding something to the scholarly landscape that isn't already there in sort of slightly more piecemeal forms through those articles. So there is a limit, I suppose, to the flexibility on that, but it's not the case that if you publish 1 or 2 journal articles that's going to be problematic, I wouldn't say.
Thank you, Roger. I think that's it's really, really helpful to have that articulated from the publisher's perspective, because I think it is something that a lot of people do worry about. We've got a question about chapter feedback. Bridget says, before proposal or only once if proposal are accepted. I mean, within this scheme, we're not looking for people to submit chapters with the proposal, but do you want to speak to that more broadly?
Yes, sorry, Claire, what was the full question for that? Just so I'm not kind of giving people the information they're not interested in.
Great, first time I did the not unmuting. Chapter feedback before proposal or only once if proposal accepted. So I think it's that question about at what point.
Just in general. Yeah. As I say, kind of initiative to one side, because obviously I guess obviously the nature of that and what we're looking for initially is just a proposal. But I mean, if you were sort of typically to approach a publisher and want to have the project considered for publication, I mean, again, it's not a one size fits all across the industry. I mean, I can speak to what we do at Bloomsbury. Again, we're pretty flexible. I mean, my advice as an editor would always be, it's always good initially to have a sort of a full detailed proposal, 7, 8 pages covering all the key bases, rationale, what's distinctive about your project, where it fits into the sort of, the landscape of the field, chapter by chapter synopses, all these kind of fundamentals. If you've got a sample chapter or 2 that you're happy with and that you feel would enhance the chances of your project getting approved, and you feel like, or you'd like to get feedback on it from external reviewers, then we're very keen to kind of facilitate that and get review feedback for a proposal alongside sample chapters. Because I think, obviously there's still a lot of work to be done there with 1 or 2 chapters written, but it does give you the opportunity to have a bit of a sounding board on the style of writing, the way that those chapters are kind of, sort of unfolding, and that might give you some really helpful steers for the rest of the writing process. So, from our perspective, that's kind of a happy medium. If people aren't ready for that and you have a detailed proposal, we're still very happy to kind of review on that basis. And sometimes people come to us and they have a full manuscript written without a contract, and they're looking for us to assess on that basis. And again, if we think the project's a good fit and sort of it lines up with what we're looking to sort of publish in terms of which areas we publish in and so on, then we'll do that. So there is that flexibility there, and most sort of reasonable editors will probably look to try and strike sort of a kind of a game plan together with you as the author of what you're happy with before it goes out for review then.
Thanks, Audrey. A question now. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and that is excellent. But I'm just forewarning you, Audrey, you're not done yet. So a question from Malta: is it a worry that IHR funded theses become open access after the embargo period, usually 5 years?
It depends. I mean, I think obviously we're very supportive of open access at Bloomsbury in principle. We have our own gold open access publishing model, and we're doing more and more open access books as Bloomsbury every year. Now, with regards to the IHR funded projects, I mean, it sort of depends on the timelines, really, I would say, in that our expectation would be that if we were able to get a book out there and published and sort of and accrue sales sort of for maybe 2 years, 3 years, if you can fit into that timeline before you're at the point where the book is going to be made open access, sort of outside of Bloomsbury, if you like, for want of a better phrase, then that wouldn't be a problem. I wouldn't have thought. I mean, if that kind of open access trigger point comes a little earlier, a little closer to after you've published, then that might be something that I would need to sort of discuss with the publishing board at Bloomsbury, and that would be a commercial decision we need to weigh up then. So it's the first time I've been asked that question, to be honest, and I can't say that for most questions we get asked in these workshops. But I mean, yeah, it's an interesting, and I think it shows the the kind of the direction of traffic on this, and I think there will be more and more of these kind of scenarios and sort of situations where a real clear sort of directive and plan of attack will be established. But I mean, as I say, I think our sort of general policy is we're very supportive of OA, and we want to and as I say, not just producing open access books ourselves, but we see that as obviously part of an important part of the future of academic publishing, and so we want to try and facilitate that wherever possible, and not make it a barrier to us working on a project.
Thank you. Good to have a question that you haven't been asked before.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I answered it all that well, but
I think that's a challenge. That's a challenge to everybody, including myself.
Exactly. If anyone does want any more information on that or something, and it's tied to kind of a specific project, I'm always happy to kind of go away and speak to people that have more authority than I to sort of work out more specifics on things like that as well. So it's interesting to kind of chat about.
I would add that over the course of the next year, there will be some other kind of workshops, IHR related, which will talk about open access in slightly different ways. So this acts as an invitation to those as well. We have a question that I think we can answer fairly straightforwardly. Can I ask if this initiative will run annually, says Amy, who is due to submit the thesis within this academic year. Good luck. And will want to convert it in the future. So I think the answer to that is yes. It would be awkward if one of us said yes and one of us said no, but I think we certainly are committed to this as a project going forward, as they say. Matthew asks, at what stage would it be acceptable to approach a publisher? Will publishers not speak to us collectively before we have the PhD in hand, or is it okay if we have a full PhD manuscript ready before being awarded? There's a follow-up or a separate question. So one question is about timing. The other point is about that some PhD theses are required to be open access after 24 months. So it's again that question of how concerning this would be. Would it help to keep something in the back pocket for the book version? So 2 points there, really, timing and
yeah. I mean, the first one I think hopefully is a fairly straightforward one to answer. I mean, my advice would be probably if you want to be on the safe side in terms of depending on who you have in mind and that kind of thing, I would always say it's probably safer to wait until you've got the PhD and you're able to submit sort of with that sort of sort of solid sort of base of saying that you've got your PhD and now you want your project to be considered. I mean, I wouldn't say that that's too, I mean, this is publishing. I mean, there are very few rules that don't have exceptions. But I mean, so I would say that if you've got a really strong project and you really feel strongly that you want to kind of try and get a publisher early, and you feel like you've got a good proposal and you've got a real sense of kind of what you want to do and so on, and you think it can stand up to peer review, kind of at the point you're at, then I wouldn't want to kind of rain on that parade, really. I'd say if that's how you feel, go for it and submit. But certainly I think about our own list, and I think about things that have been progressed to kind of publication. I can't, if I'm honest, I can't think off the top of my head of any instances immediately where I could think, well, you'll be signing that person up before they've got their PhD. So that probably gives you some indication of sort of the likely sort of timing, I suppose. In terms of the open access thing, I guess I would have to go away and because everything is kind of, when it comes to open access, there are lots of specifics, I guess, that need kind of thinking about. I mean, if we're talking about an institutional repository, for example, then there are some differences, as you say, the more difference you can make between what is available freely online and what you then potentially be looking to sell as a publisher, as a commercial publisher ultimately, then I think the stronger case you're going to have for being able to kind of get that project approved and published. Again, it's both a case of sort of this sort of discontinuities, for want of a better word, between the two sort of texts, and also kind of accessibility, as I say, to do with kind of if we're talking about a repository, then that maybe is sort of not widely accessed and so on and so forth, then there may be an argument to be made there that although the book is available open access, it's not widely available, and things like that can come into consideration then as well. And it's again, another consideration will be different publishers will have different philosophies on this as well. I mean, we're very pro open access, and we would we would take each situation on its own merit and look to try and sort of find ways forward to facilitate that. Others might be a little bit more cautious. So it's also about kind of like, I suppose, trying to find the kinds of publishers with the right sort of culture when it comes to open access, and then you're more likely to sort of find a way forward, I would say.
Thanks, Audrey. I'm going to continue reading out the questions just because we've got so many of them, and I think it's probably the most efficient way of doing it. It's genuinely not because I like the sound of my own voice. I really don't. But I am keeping an eye on if any hands go up and people do want to take the opportunity to ask them themselves. We've got another question which takes that that relationship between thesis and book from a slightly different angle, which can the titles be identical? Must the booking, so that's quite an interesting question, isn't it, around the title? And then must there be new material? This is from Adil. Someone once told me their publisher required the book to include no more than 80% of material that was in the thesis.
It's quite a specific threshold. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as title is concerned, I mean, if I'm honest, and this maybe answers the question, I can't think I've ever, I get a book proposal in from somebody that's presenting something as a conversion from thesis. I may not necessarily even know what the thesis title is. If it's not there and they've not given me that information, I may not feel compelled to look it up, because quite frankly, I'm just assessing the book project, and we don't see the two as competing. Ultimately a thesis is a thesis, and if the title is doing what I need it to from a kind of a commercial point of view as a publisher, then I'm certainly not going to change that because it was the same as a thesis. Now whether that's viable, I mean, whether there are many thesis titles that serve to effectively act as successful monograph book titles that kind of do the job that you need them to from a kind of a publisher's perspective, that might be a sort of a trickier task than it sort of sounds at first. So yeah, I think hopefully that answers that one. In terms of thresholds, I mean, again, everything in through the lens of what we've been talking about, what I was sort of rabbiting on about for the first half an hour, about like those changes that I think organically, you want to be sort of striving to make from thesis to the monograph. There should be adaptations. There should be changes. I wouldn't expect the text to look the same. If for no other reason, putting content to one side, just the way it's structured, the way it reads, how you quote, how you footnote, all these things that we've covered. So I wouldn't expect, I wouldn't expect much of it to be kind of, verbatim, if you like, from thesis to monograph. If we're talking about kind of like, in a more general sense, kind of like the points that are being made and the kind of the source material that's being drawn on, that kind of thing. I mean, it's less of an issue from a thesis than it is, we're talking about journal articles. If things are available and they're out there in the sort of the wider scholarly world as published material, whether that's the journal, so on, then there's a sort of a semi-argument there that what you're then producing, or for a kind of the academic library market, is material that they may have already bought in the form of journals, or it's material that is already accessible to their scholars. So why would they buy it again? That's always the latent sort of tension with kind of material that you publish in a book versus things that are published in journal articles and so on. But I mean, if we're talking about content and source, points that are being made and scholarship that's included in a thesis, and you want to include a lot of that in the text, as long as it's, as I say, resurfaced for the academic book market, the monograph market that you're trying to reach, then that's fine, because we don't really think of that material having been in the thesis as competing. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Audrey. I would just add, I think that when you're at the end of completing your thesis, or you've just completed it, it's very hard to imagine that it will take a form different to the thesis, because it's kind of, it's been the center of your life for so long. But then once you've done the book, you realize just how different the book actually ends up being from the thesis, because it is a different audience, as Audrey said at the beginning. Now, Michael would like to know whether there are a limited number of books. Do you have a quota of books that you publish per year, or within particular themes? You may not be able to answer that, I don't know.
No, it's a pretty for good and bad, it's a pretty, I have a minimum target, which feels not that minimum, quite frankly, of books that I need to sort of commission each year, and I'll be looking to do that. And there's as a division, as a history list, as a team, we want to try and have what we see as kind of like a healthy mix of different book types, and we see research monographs as a really important, sort of one of the most important features of that, with PhD theses within that as a subsection, being vitally important to us, not only sort of bringing through and supporting the best of the up and coming sort of academics that are working in history, but also for the greater good of the discipline. This is the way we feel it should be done. And so we have a lot of flexibility in terms of we, as I said earlier, we publish books of all types for the academic community, really, whether that's kind of handbooks or reference works, or books that we think of as supplementary reading for undergraduate classes and so on. So that allows us to be quite flexible. We don't put a kind of a square peg into a round hole kind of thing. And yeah, in terms of quotas, I mean, if a book project is good, I'm never going to turn something away. I'll find space for it. I'll, even if we're pushed, if something comes in and it fits what we're doing and it feels like it could find a good home on the list, then we will take it forward and look to publish it.
That's very good news. Magali has a question about new material, and I think this is a question that really asks to what extent should we be explicit in our proposals about how much new material there actually is, as opposed to thesis material, particularly if actually you only want to use a small amount of material from the thesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always useful to know. I mean, certainly, I think that, as I said earlier, barring a situation where, there's an incredibly high proportion of the book that has effectively already been, shopped in journal articles, for want of a better phrase, to the point where you may have a slight concern that kind of is going to, dramatically lessen interest from scholarly libraries, who look at it and find, when they check the sort of the acknowledgements and so on, that they've already got 8 out of 9 of these chapters because they've appeared as journal articles. That aside, I think, from our perspective as a publisher, whether there's 20% of the thesis that's gone into it as a monograph, or whether you've actually taken things on, gone in different directions, and so on. The opposite, really, isn't it? If it was 80% of the thesis, or you've taken it in different directions and you've gone on, and actually by the time you've ended up with your book project, you're thinking, well, hang on, actually it's only about 20% of my thesis that's actually going to end up in this book. That's totally fine. I think the important thing for us, in a way, is that you're kind of unencumbered by thinking too much about thresholds like that, especially if we're talking things that have been published in journal articles. The important thing is, just think about the book in isolation almost, and think, right, this is the field, this is the literature that's out there, this is my book, this is what I want to say, and this is what I need to do, what I need to cover to get there. And whether that means you end up shelving a lot of the thesis or not, then that from our perspective, it's more important that you're kind of sort of thinking about that key trajectory of this book now, and that arc and where it's going, and it's and then it's cutting your cloth accordingly then in terms of the material you use from your thesis to help sort of drive that, I think.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we've addressed the question of material that's already out there in journals, even if it's out there in open access journals. We've established that that's okay. That's just what happens as part of the academic career. But this is an interesting one. So, how much patience would a publisher have for further research to improve the PhD? So I suppose this is a question about how long from sending in the proposal to wanting to have the completed manuscript. How long is the norm? 1-2 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I would say, generally speaking, if we say reach a point where we have a project, say a proposal reviewed and it reviews successfully, and I get approval and we put a contract in place, typically I would expect those discussions around delivery date to probably be looking at in the range of kind of 18 months to 2 years would be typical. Some people already have a lot of it written, and you may sort of be surprised and they say, oh, actually, I could get this to you in 7 months or whatever it may be. again, we try not to be too prescriptive. I mean, because ultimately a good book is a good book, and I mean we're quite sort of we try to take quite a long. As I say, I can only speak to Bloomsbury and what we do really, but I mean, we try to take quite a long-term sort of approach to things anyway. I don't want to lose a book just because if an author feels like they need, particularly with academic publishing, when people may have teaching loads to deal with, all sorts of other, sort of aspects of the day job that get in the way of progressing that text in the way that you might want it to. And I think we're talking about kind of sort of as part of this initiative, I think one of the things that we're talking about is like the ways in which people are sort of at a disadvantage. And I think time is such a precious commodity and is one of the things that kind of a lot of early career scholars sadly aren't afforded in various different contexts. It's not just it's not just about money, it's time as well. And actually, we try to take a very kind of relaxed approach to that. And if somebody needs to take 3, 4, 5 years, I mean, we've got projects that have been signed up this year that have got delivery dates in 2026. I wouldn't want all my projects to be like that because we'd have a bit of a gap in the whole publishing program then. But that's still something that's there and available. We try and make that available to people if they need that sort of time.
Thank you. And I think it's worth adding, it does take some of us a very long time to write our books. So I think that it's important to remember that people don't just churn them out as quickly as perhaps we might think. I've got a question.
Sorry, Claire, I just wanted to add one further thing there as well, just because I sort of half had this thought and it escaped me, but I think it's worth mentioning to people as well. I think we're also very aware, we're very realistic, particularly on the history list of Bloomsbury. Again, what we do. Things change over time as well. You know what I mean? Like just because you sign a contract and it says that something needs to be in 18 months time, there's a lot of things that can happen in 18 months. And say over a number of years of working on the list, I've had, all sorts of things, good and bad, happen to authors that in that time that, result in them having to maybe postpone the book's delivery, and we are very realistic about that. And we, very collaborative, and we're never going to be the kind of team that sort of looks to draw a line under things at the first sign of there being any kind of need for adjustment. We try and find a way of making things work and accommodating people when real life sort of gets in the way.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, particularly in terms of ensuring that history writing is as inclusive as it possibly can be. Can I ask a question from Masuda? Is this initiative open to scholars of literary history? Do you have works of literary history in your list, Rodri?
Yeah, I mean, we do. I mean, we benefit from the fact that Bloomsbury, that we, as a history list, we are part of an academic publishing division that, publishes across various core subjects, if you like. Sort of obviously we have a literary studies list. We have politics, philosophy, music, education, you name it, religious studies, a whole raft of subject areas. And our ability to kind of cross market into all of those disciplines with any book that we get, that may sort of draw on audiences from multiple sort of subject areas. That's something we look to do, and the way we sort of, without wanting to go into too much boring sort of coding detail, the way we kind of code up our projects is so that they are marketed into those different areas. So, our mailing list, say for literary studies, a book that was in the field of literary history, which we do have a few projects. There's a real kind of I'd probably say sort of social and cultural kind of bent to our history list anyway. That's a real kind of feature of kind of that we do a lot of, we're quite prominent in publishing in those areas. We're able to kind of reach our mailing lists for history, for a book like that, and also for literary studies. So we welcome the opportunity to kind of have text that maybe have that tinge of interdisciplinarity. Because from our perspective, it makes commercial sense as well as sort of intellectual sense. So we'd certainly welcome anything in that arena.
Good. We still have the questions coming. Are you okay to continue, Audrey?
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't
Yeah,
need a glass of water or anything to.
yeah. Well, I've sort of I've emptied one glass of water, but don't worry, I'll soldier on.
Okay, so I think this question of the relationship between the book and the PhD is really at the core of what a lot of people are interested in. So I've got a question from Dean, which is really this sense of, again, it's the kind of question about how different the book needs to be from the PhD. But is that difference one of kind of scope? Does it necessarily need to be pitched in a broader way than a sort of more narrowly focused PhD, or is there a place for the narrowly focused monograph?
It's a really good question. I mean, if I'm brutally honest, I think that my advice would be to anyone that feels like their thesis topic is a little maybe narrow. There's probably it's probably a reason why you've got, even especially when it's your own work, it's probably a reason why you've got that link in. And I'd probably advise you to kind of look at a few publishers' websites and just have a look at a few. It probably wouldn't take that long. I would maybe just sort of familiarize yourself with some of the book titles, research monographs that those publishers are publishing, and just get a sense of kind of the type of scope that is out there, that's being published, because that, I think, will probably give you a bit of a sense of where a publisher sees things in terms of the breadth they'd be looking for in terms of a topic. I mean, I think about my list, and when a project comes in, and obviously what you're looking for is, we appreciate that with a research monograph, you're not necessarily you're not looking to compete with John Grisham or anything when it comes to size of readership or anything. But what you are looking for is kind of some of those indicators that make you think, oh, hang on, we can reach a wide enough audience in, say, French history, European history, or whatever it may be. If I see something that feels really narrow on like some of the parameters we were talking about earlier on, like geography and chronology, and even with a nice juicy theme, then you start to look at it and think, well, how many people are really going to be interested in kind of nuns in 1860s Southwest France or whatever. It's too kind of yeah, well, yeah, now you mention it. And that's not to disparage any topic, but it's just to think about it from a kind of a commercial point of view. Something, a book could be really interesting, and it can be, and it can do, it can be well written and an excellent text. But obviously, from a publisher's point of view, you want to feel like there is going to be a kind of a wide enough sort of circle of people that are going to be wanting this book on, initially on shelves in research libraries, and then sort of the way we publish, 18 months later after hardback publication, all of our books become available in paperback. So we want to try and get books in the hands of as many people as possible. But if we feel like there are limitations to what that market might be because of some of the scope, if you like, of the book, then I would, if I got something like that and a project in, and I felt like, oh, this looks, there's real potential here, but it feels narrow, I'd probably try and see if somebody could be nudged in that direction, just to think a little bit wider and a little bit bigger. But if you can do that yourself, that might be, when we're talking about that kind of shift from thesis to monograph, that might be one of the challenges. That might be one of the key elements of what that means for you, for your project. It won't be the case for everyone. But certainly, if you're feeling that way, and another bit of advice, talking about feedback, speak to colleagues, speak to people in your department that have got experience of working on numerous books and have got a lot of publications under their belt, because often sort of a good honest colleague will kind of be able to have a bit of the commercial awareness of some of the things I'm talking about, but might actually be able to give you a bit more of a concrete, helpful steer on how you go about that than a publisher would. So that they can be a good source of support in those sorts of scenarios.
Thank you. Mina has asked a question, which we've touched on already, but I think there's a little bit more to say about it. So, can we submit a proposal before submitting the thesis? Now, I mean, we've kind of talked about that a little bit. I just wanted to say something around that, actually, from a kind of supervisory external examiner perspective. Because I think that having seen quite a lot of PhDs go through to completion, there is something that happens in those final stages where you're kind of holding the whole thesis in your head, which may be familiar to some of you who have just finished, where your sense of the project just shifts, and you that's the point where you really go, that's why it matters. That's the so what. And I think that's why waiting till the thesis is in, and arguably waiting until you've had your viva, because that's another moment, that moment of the PhD viva where you get to be in a room and people's only thing they're going to talk about is that thing you spent years researching and writing. Isn't just a stressful and potentially joyful experience. It's also an opportunity to, again, get feedback and to crystallize what the kind of point of the project is, and looking at the reports on the viva, and then engaging with your external examiner and asking them to give you feedback on, drafts of proposals if they're willing to give that. So I just thought it might be useful to add in that perspective in relation to Mina's question. There's another question which is from Tracy: is there an age limit for an early career researcher? No, absolutely not. Early career researcher category is not an age category. It is a career category. And I think, as somebody pointed out lower down in the chat, this would actually be a discrimination case. So I think it's really important. It's important in terms of terminology as well. We've got now, I'm losing control of my chat function. Satoshi, 2 questions on eligibility. Finished earlier this year, employed in a teaching university. Does this disqualify me? As you say, those in employment are not eligible. That's a very good question. So I suppose this is a question about being employed on a teaching only rather than teaching and research contract, which my sense is that does not disqualify somebody from this initiative. Rodri?
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, again, I think, maybe we need to revisit our wording around that, just to make sure that's a bit clearer. But yeah, I mean, my feeling is that, again, I think this, without wanting it to be too fuzzy an answer, I think that, anyone that comes across the initiative and thinks that this is for them, I think we're interested in hearing from them and hearing, why they feel that way and what their project's about. And I think we kind of will sort of consider everything with an open mind on that basis, really. And as you say, I don't think that should be, that situation should be a barrier to sort of putting something forward.
And we've got a second follow-up question there from the same person. Is it a good idea to include, okay, so we've talked about this a bit. I think, should you include your literature methodological discussions, perhaps in the author's preface? So, showing your scholarly apparatus, but kind of corralling it into one place. What do you think?
I'm still probably in the camp of I don't think it's really necessary, because I think to my mind, I think part of having a published monograph really is that there shouldn't be any doubt, have the confidence of knowing that nobody's questioning your knowledge of the field. It's a totally different sort of mindset to that thesis, and you don't have to show your workings with a research monograph, a published monograph. it's all about you. It's all about your ideas and what you're offering the literature. Now, obviously, there are appropriate moments to touch on existing literature, and you might feel that there are specific important things that you want to say. And so I'm not saying, sort of write the book, obviously, to the exclusion of any reference to books that have gone before, because obviously that's a pretty silly thing to say. But don't feel the need for these kind of lengthy, whether it's in an author preface, an introduction, however you want to, wherever you want to sort of frame it. I don't think it, sort of that kind of material needs to be given too much oxygen, really, particularly kind of for its kind of to its own end as well, if that makes sense. As I say, if you can weave in particularly pertinent elements of that work into the main text itself at appropriate points, then by all means do that. I think it's a good way of adding a richness and the depth of the text. It's and it's worthwhile. But and as I say, I don't feel like, I know it can be tempting, but some things just need to be cut. They just need to be left at the thesis station when you get on that train. And so although it may be a bit kind of sort of a bit of a bind to have to do it, sometimes that's the best way. I wouldn't advocate a kind of a big sort of exposition on the literature in the field anyway.
Thank you, Rodri. I think your point that it's also important to make sure that you pay your dues to the people whose work you're building on, and also who you're having a conversation with, is important. I submitted a proposal to Bloomsbury just a week ago, which will go out to review. Am I eligible to apply? Not me. This is Sabira.
Good question. I don't, and forgive me if this has come to me, Sabira, but I don't think that's one that's come to me. So I guess that would probably have to be a conversation I would have to have with whoever the commissioning editor is that would be responsible for the book, if it's come into us and it's now gone up for review. So I might find that they, depending on sort of how it progresses, I might find that they are a bit reluctant to relinquish the project now. So that will depend. I mean, it may be a case of if you want to drop me an email separately offline to kind of see where that's up to, then we can always explore sort of where we've reached if you'd rather see the book kind of get considered for the initiative. Alternatively, I mean, I dare I say this, if you want to sort of submit and have that conversation, should you be shortlisted, then that might be, I'm not sure how the other editor will feel about me saying that, but that might be, from thinking about it from your perspective, that might be, that it might not be a conversation you need to have with that editor, depending on how they feel about it for their list, until you sort of know whether you've reached that important marker in this particular initiative, if that makes sense.
Good question. I think this is aimed at you. Also wondering if we can write to you outside of this competition to assess if the thesis is worth publishing in some form, basically advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, always feel like you can drop me an email, whether it's now or any point in the future. We're very much a kind of, we try to keep things pretty transparent and open door, and if I can offer any thoughts or give you anything useful, then I'm always happy to kind of to share thoughts.
Excellent question from Annalise. The form asks for 5 suggestions for peer reviewers, and the question is, do you have to have checked with them if they're willing to offer a review? And I think these are the kind of questions that can be really difficult, because sometimes it's at a stage in the career where it's difficult to ask those people. Rodri, what do you think?
Oh yeah, no, I think, as you said, we're really getting into some areas which are really useful, because I will plead not guilty to this, in that I didn't devise the wording of the form. So I think the form is a little bit confusing at that point, really, come to think of it, which is, we'd actually prefer you not to get in contact with any of those reviewers. It's not really, we don't think it's, really advisable, or sort of what we're after really is for anyone to be teeing up reviewers. reviewers. You know, we will do the legwork and we will get in touch. We're basically just looking for suggestions that you might want to put forward for people that you think would be suitable from a kind of a a position in the field point of view, you know, making use of your knowledge basically of who you think might be suitable reviewers. You know, we wouldn't want you to kind of be feeling like you have to tap anyone up or contact anyone on that in that way. You know, that's for us to do and for us to look to try and sort of tease out the reviewer feedback that we need at our end once we know we're in that position and we want to push things forward. And again, I'd also say that, you know, five is quite a punchy number. You know, if you find, I mean, we'll do a little bit, obviously a bit of, you know, sort of research ourselves who we think will be suitable reviewers. So if you find yourself getting to 3 or whatever it is and thinking, oh, actually, that's, you know, after this I'm sort of struggling, don't be holding up submitting a proposal on that basis. You know, sort of, you know, these are kind of like little, you know, details that are nice to haves in a proposal rather than, you know, necessary requirements. So, you know, don't let that hold you up. You know, but again, you know, further thought is, you know, the quicker you feel like you can rattle off sort of those reviewers, I think that's also a good indication. Sometimes it's a really kind of indirect good indicator that, you know, a project's maybe got a healthy market. You know, there's enough, this book is in dialogue with enough people's research, and, you know, that I can quickly identify people that would be able to offer something useful to say about it. You know, I think that in itself is always a nice kind of you know, sort of gentle indicator as to what potential a book's got.
Thank you. So quote from Bridget about getting feedback from others, which I think getting feedback from as many people as you can is really important. Questions around embargoes and the shift in the embargo. I mean, I think that whatever the HRC does in terms of the embargo, this is something that is going to affect all PhD students in the arts and humanities, and publishers are going to have to respond to that, aren't they? Yeah. Arts, history of art. So this is variation on the literary history of art and visual culture topics. I guess that's the same answer, really, isn't it? Would they be able to fit your list?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing with history of art and sort of visual culture, the only thing to bear in mind there is we do have a visual culture list. I know, you know, we've got, you know, sort of a thriving list in that area. So again, we've got the opportunity to kind of cross promote and make, you know, sort of make use of both of those markets. Now, the only thing to bear in mind, I suppose, with conversations I've had with 1 or 2 authors that have submitted projects with that type of crossover, is obviously you do often introduce the additional dynamic there of kind of, there's often kind of like they're very highly illustrated, those books, you know, or there's a real, you know, sort of desire to have color images and that kind of thing. You know, that can introduce, you know, further complications to do with production costs and, you know, sort of profitability and all of these things that can sort of, you know, complicate the picture further. Obviously, if people you know, want the book to be highly illustrated and they want a lot of color illustrations, I mean, generally speaking, I would say that from a kind of a monograph perspective, we'd be looking for some sort of subsidy really to be able to kind of facilitate that often, or we'd have to look to try and find clever ways of you know, producing the book, you know, with fewer color images. And, you know, it then becomes a bit of a discussion, obviously, on a case-by-case basis as to what somebody's requirements are and what they're looking for from their publication, you know. And that may be that, you know, they're better off suited to, say, a publisher that specializes more in art history books than we do specifically, because their production setup will be geared up for color illustration, you know, in a more kind of sort of typical way, really. So there's those kinds of things that are worth considering. And again, browsing and shopping publishers to kind of work out, well, what kind of a look do I want for my book? Where am I seeing those books publishing? That will also shortcut things for you as well a little bit, I think, in kind of identifying, you know, if you can see that, you know, a particular publisher is producing books in the style and, with the aesthetic that you're looking for. And obviously that's maybe really important to you if you've got a book of this kind, this ilk, then that's certainly something to kind of do a bit of research on ahead of time.
Thank you. So we've got, I think we've got a hard end of 4. If Rodri, if you can last that till 4. We've got 45 new messages in the chat, which I'm keeping an eye on. I'm going to try and cover as many as we possibly can, but if some have already been sort of addressed, then I will kind of just sort of try and pull out the newer ones. This is a great question. They're all great questions, and they're all things I would like to know. This one, Jesus, can you say a little about the finances? Is there ever an advance? How do royalties work? Also, how do you decide price point and whether the book can go into trade outlets?
We're really getting the microscope onto me now, aren't we? No, that's fine. Right, where to start? So yeah, I mean, advances generally, I mean, again, like, without sort of, I don't think I'm giving away anything. There's some big secret or some sort of massive outlier when it comes to the industry. I mean, as an academic press, we generally only give advances for either, say, student textbooks that are going to have a big print run, that are going to be able to allow us to facilitate, an advance with the kind of the royalty package that we have there, because then we're talking bigger print runs. The anticipation is bigger revenues for those books than, say, a scholarly monograph, and so they kind of work to a different publishing model. Generally speaking, research monographs, we're not in a position to kind of offer an advance. We typically, sort of offer kind of, royalties on net receipts. Those are kind of standard rates, on hardback and ebook, and then with a paperback to come in 18 months' time. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to divulge what those are, but I mean, they're probably, easily enough found out if you speak to authors that we've contracted. I'm trying to think what the other bits of the question were now. In terms of things like publishing price points, I mean, typically, if you look at our website, you'll see our research monographs are basically at kind of a flat £85 retail price in hardback, with the expectation that we are publishing these books for the academic library market in the first instance. And the ebooks will probably be around £76.50. I mean, what people actually pay for them, or what libraries actually pay for them, will be less than those numbers, because you knock the discount on there and whatever the sales channel is, and so it'll be less than that. Now, one of the good things about our monograph publishing, as I mentioned a little earlier, is that unlike some other publishers, we automatically, irrespective of sales, make those books available in paperback 18 months after they first come out in hardback. So any book we publish on the list, either immediately or 18 months later, is available at a kind of an individual purchase price. Our paperback monographs, when they come out in 18 months' time, they tend to retail at about £28.99. So you can pick one of those up for kind of probably on Amazon or whatever for like £22 or something, 18 months after they first come out as a hardback research monograph. So quite, we're sort of, that's a model that's worked for us well as far as hardback monographs are concerned, and it's got a bit more flexibility to it, and allows you as the author to reach a wider readership with that paperback offering, down the road, than, say, maybe some of those presses that require high sales to unlock that, or maybe don't offer paperback at all. So I think in that sense we're sort of quite an attractive option in the market, I suppose.
Okay, I'm going to pull a couple of questions together. So Tracy and also Nina, this question of whether people have to have a university affiliation currently in order to qualify for this scheme. I mean, I think our sense is no. This is the point, really, is that we are very attuned to the difficulties of early career researchers at the moment, and those affiliations may not be available. So that's certainly not a barrier.
And I mean, even outside of the initiative, I mean, every year, I mean, I can't think of anyone to give you a specific name right now, but I mean, I know just every year we publish books by independent scholars, that may not necessarily be affiliated to university. So even just generally on the list, university affiliation at any particular time isn't necessarily a requirement by any stretch.
2 questions about Bloomsbury. So firstly, if you could say a little bit about, your support for ECR researchers, why it's a good place for ECRs to publish, and secondly, what your position is on more experimental, interdisciplinary arts-based practice as research. Those questions from Marina and from Edmund.
Good questions. Well, hopefully, I mean, I don't want to kind of repeat myself, other than to maybe draw attention to one or two things that I've touched on already, which I think maybe speak to the whole kind of, you know, what sort of benefits do you get as an ERC coming to kind of Bloomsbury or working with Bloomsbury, is that, you know, certainly, as I say, I think what I talked about there with the publishing model and the fact that, you know, you can have a hardback and an ebook and then a paperback further down the line as kind of as standard. You know, if you publish with us as a research monograph, I think that's a really, you know, sort of valuable sort of thing to flag, because, you know, in terms of discoverability and making your work as kind of widely known to the market as possible, you know, we deliver on that. You know, there are other aspects that help with that discoverability that we're really strong on. You know, we build in, you know, numerous you know, sort of gratis copies into our print runs, so that we effectively send out peer, you know, sort of journal review copies to any journal basically that you're interested in sending to, as well as a kind of a strong core list of publications that we send out to anyway. You know, we're very strong on things like prizes. You know, we have sort of like a designated member of the marketing team who literally spends each month sort of trawling the various sort of annals of the web and beyond to kind of identify suitable prizes that we then, as an individual list level, try and work out suitable candidates to enter. And, you know, that's a regular thing that we sort of you know, sort of work very hard at trying to give all of our books the greatest possible opportunity of winning prizes. And I think from a kind of an author care point of view, you know, we strike a nice balance at Bloomsbury in that we are an independent publisher. So when you work with us, you know, we're not owned by some shadowy media conglomerate. We are independent, although we may seem big, you know, so things don't have to go to a sort of, you know, committee 3 times removed for us to make a decision. You know, it's much more, you know, close knit. It's author, editor, publishing board, you know, and that's it really. You know, that's how all the key decisions get made, which means we can be efficient, you know, light on our feet. You know, we're happy to kind of, you know, experiment with new ideas. Maybe touching on to the you know, second part of the question, you know, we're sort of, you know, working now with short format text that we're working on. They've got a sort of a short format series launching early next year, little sort of 40,000 word, $12.99, introductory German history textbooks that I'm working on with a number of scholars that sort of sees German history right the way through from the medieval era through to the modern day. And so that's a new thing that we're experimenting with, those kind of you know, shorter format books. Yeah, and as I say, we're sort of independent spirit, allows us to sort of act very quickly, be open to new ideas. But whilst at the same time, obviously being an academic division as part of a bigger publishing house that has very strong trade divisions, obviously with Harry Potter and the children's division, you know, we have a lot of clout, we have a lot of muscle that we can flex from a sales and marketing point of view. You know, we have offices in London, New York, Sydney, New Delhi, and we've got kind of sales and marketing forces all over the world. So every book we publish, we can kind of reach as global and Anglophone audience as possible. But it's, you know, so you get that infrastructure, but you get to have your cake and eat it really, because as I say, we're independent, you know, sort of company, independent spirit, and so you get that kind of slightly more bespoke author care. I think, you know, we're a tight-knit editorial team on the history list. There's just 3 of us commissioning, myself, Emily Drew, the editorial director, and Maddie Holder, the senior commissioning editor. And, you know, we sort of pride ourselves on sort of open lines of communication. You know, we don't like to leave people hanging about. We're very transparent in the way we deal with people and collaborative in the way we want to sort of work with people right the way from the start of the process, you know, through to publication and beyond. And, you know, another thing to flag, I suppose, in that respect is, you know, I said earlier we're quite long-termist. I mean, I'm part of furniture. I've been there like 11 years, and I'm not planning to go anywhere anytime soon. I like to start, I like to develop relationships with authors, over several books. I can think of a few authors I've worked with now on like 4 or 5 books, and we want to be able to develop authors. We want to be able to sort of facilitate academics in their on their journeys and their careers, and offer that support from the writing perspective, not just necessarily just sign books up and chuck them out. We have a much bigger sort of mindset when it comes to what we're looking to do.
Thanks, Audrey. In terms of the interdisciplinarity and practice-based research, I'm assuming that the history list has that kind of capacious sense, because history itself is capacious in that way. But am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we're very, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and do, either now or later, if somebody wants to email me. I mean, yeah, we're very interested, as I touched earlier, we've got other lists that kind of, are allied to us quite nicely with regards to education, philosophy. We released the Bloomsbury History Theory and Method online digital resource last year. And so ideas around kind of like the theoretical underpinnings of the subject, and how that relates to and how the subject relates to the wider humanities and social sciences. We've got a lot of work that we do both on the print side and with that digital resource that finds ways of grappling with those ideas, both at a kind of like a research monograph level, and also at a kind of a student facing level as well. So yeah, we're certainly interested in sort of moving that conversation forward as part of what we publish.
And I'll skip to this question because it relates to what you were saying about Bloomsbury as this kind of as having this kind of international reach. If Verity asks, if a significant market for your book is in a non-English speaking country, do you ever facilitate publishing a work in more than one language?
Yeah, I mean, we're very lucky in that we have an excellent translation and rights team at Bloomsbury. So I mean, we generally look to kind of attract any book we publish in all languages, sort of worldwide. And one of the main reasons for that is because we have such a strong translation and rights team. I get emails from our rights team. I'd like to say I probably get like half a dozen emails a month from our rights team relating to titles on my list that they've secured translation rights deals for, from everywhere from China right across Europe, all over. And they're extremely good at kind of striking the best deals and getting sort of the word out there, and getting books published in as many languages as possibly can be facilitated. And obviously they're also very attuned to specific opportunities as well, with regards to thinking about history. If a book is on German history or French history or whatever it may be, obviously there is a particular sort of opportunity there in that national language. So and they're keen to pursue opportunities and take suggestions from authors, and and basically do all the hard work, because that is actually for authors. It's it's another thing to have to worry about. Sometimes people ask me, oh well, I'd quite like to hold on to those rights, or I'd quite like to sort of do my own thing with that. And we're not kind of too hard line on it. I mean, ultimately, if somebody says that and they really feel strongly about it, then we probably still look to contract. I don't think it would start sort of ground things to a halt. But I would always advise people that really there's a lot of work and networking and knowledge and everything that goes into kind of striking those kinds of deals, and having a rights team like that at our disposal. Partly again harking back to what I was saying earlier about being part of a publisher that has a trade division and so on. Not all academic presses have that kind of a rights department, and they are really good at working on our academic titles. So yeah, that's something we can, we're very keen on looking to kind of support authors with.
How long does it take from submitting the book to it appearing as a book? Asked Michael, but he asks that it better than I did just then.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about, it's a bit easier to talk in kind of sort of more certain terms with a book once we've had the kind of the final version of the manuscript that we're passing to production. So when we initially get a manuscript, we get it in, we'd look to get at least one full peer review then of the manuscript for you at that point. Now, obviously, how long that reviewer takes, and then what the suggestions that come out of that review are, and how, what your timeline is looking like for making kind of those final tweaks and adjustments. That can, how long is a piece of string to a degree, it can vary. But once we've got the final version of the manuscript, we'll do our in-house editorial checks, pass it to the production team, and then generally from the point at which they sort of take the manuscript, it's about sort of 6 to 7 months to publication. Then you'll see it'll get copy edited, proofread. You'll see first proofs, finals that you can comment on, and there'll be some back and forth between you and the copy editor. As you just hammer out the last details, and yeah, that whole sort of process takes about 7 months in total.
And are there opportunities for ECRs to become peer reviewers? Asks Jenny.
Yeah, I glanced at that one quickly as I was kind of scrolling up, trying to make find my way in the chat. I mean, yeah, certainly we'd be interested in hearing from people. I mean, we're always interested in sort of diversifying our pool of reviewers and sort of getting thoughts from ECRs and certain projects that they feel that even if somebody were to drop me a line and say, oh, well, actually, if you get a project in on, this and this, 18th century history, early modern Europe, whatever it may be, that they want to kind of throw their hat in the ring for, then, we can kind of add them to a list that we've got in the team here and try and keep them in mind then if anything suitable crops up.
And I would just add to that, the IHR has a journal, Historical Research, and we're very keen to involve ECRs in the peer review processes for that journal as well. Because I think actually understanding peer review is a really, really important thing. It's another thing that sometimes feels, I think, quite mysterious and needs demystifying, and also needs good people to do it, who have the subject knowledge and the generosity to do it. Okay, I'm looking down here. There are some Katie. Is there some? Yeah. Is it possible to submit a proposal to Bloomsbury if they are not successful in this initiative?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I don't want anyone to feel like this initiative is going to cause them more problems than solutions, if that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I certainly, as Claire and I were talking a little earlier, we really have no idea how many people are going to want to submit for this initiative. And, it is ultimately, it's like anything, isn't it? I mean, there are no, in a way it feels difficult to sort of say, oh, well, these projects are the ones that we're going to shortlist. It could be no real reflection on, the potential of a project that doesn't get shortlisted. I wouldn't want anyone to feel disheartened if they feel that they've got something sort of good on their hands. Not getting shortlisted for this initiative doesn't mean that it won't go on to be a really great book, and there's nothing to say that it wouldn't go on to be a really great book that Bloomsbury would want to publish, so don't read too much into anything there. I think I would always advise you that if you want to submit for the initiative, great, and obviously we will consider everything as kind of even-handedly as we can and work out kind of where we think we want to go then with the shortlisting. But don't think that's a closed door for Bloomsbury. If you want to engage me directly with a proposal, or depending on what the project is outside of this initiative, it may sit with another commissioning editor at Bloomsbury more appropriately. Like I said earlier, the door is open. Just drop us a line, and if I think we can make it work, or if I think if a fellow editor thinks they can make it work, we'll be upfront with you, and can always see where things can be taken.
Okay, I'm going to just address a few things that I think we've kind of touched on, but just to clarify for everybody. So yes, we do hope there will be a call for this project every year. And I think I'm right in saying, Rodri, do correct me if I'm wrong, that if people don't have 5 suitable reviewers, that doesn't stop them from applying in any way whatsoever, does it?
No, no, yeah, just to, yeah, definitely reiterate that. Yeah, I mean, even if you can only think of 2 reviewers, write them down to say, don't let that hold up your proposal, your application. And and as I say, I'd go as far to say, actually do not contact any of them. You know what I mean? One, it's something we would never expect you to do, and it's something else for you to have to think about. And yeah, so please don't. It's just about identifying a few names that you think would be suitable and popping them on the form. And if you can think of a few more, then great. But it's not a requirement.
A very acute question from Martha, who has eagle-eyed, as a good researcher, has spotted that there have been 2 dates given as the closing date for this, the 31st of October and the 30th of November. We were going to clarify at the end. We decided to extend the deadline because so that people can fully take on what we've talked about in this session, and in the knowledge that there will be a lot of people who can't be at this session and who will be watching this as a recording later on. So we did want to give people a little bit more time. So the definitive, absolutely final closing date for this will be the 30th of November. And the submission email is given on the application, on the proposal form. We won't be able to extend it beyond the 30th of November because then we'll get into that problem of actually being able to do the different parts of the process according to the schedule that we really do want to keep to. Okay, let's have a look what else I've got here. And of course, Gemma had already added that to the chat. Thanks, Gemma. So support for the idea of short form books. So thank yous. I'm just looking down to see if there's anything that we've missed. Tamara, my work has both a critical, historical and political, and a creative component, docudrama style hybrid piece. Can I apply to the scheme with both pieces?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I would say we're open to taking a look at what you have. It's difficult to say I certainly wouldn't want to be dismissive of anything that has something a bit more, a creative dimension to it without looking at the details. So yeah, I would sort of say, do put something together for us. Or if you're kind of thinking, I'm not ready to kind of maybe put the whole thing together in a proposal document yet, and you want to sort of send a paragraph or two, a few paragraphs that you've already got in some shape or form on email for us to kind of get a bit more of a sense and get into a bit of a dialogue into whether one or both are suitable, then we could always look to do that separately.
Marvellous. And do you pass proposals on to other parts of Bloomsbury if we submit to the wrong part? I.e., if we submit to you and then you think it's better fit somewhere else?
Yeah, certainly on the academic side. I mean, this is something that comes up sort of from time to time, given the nature of the Bloomsbury beast. Certainly on the academic side, we're very, it's very much a case of trying to identify, whose lists a book would sit on most appropriately, where it would be done justice the most, really. And so if something comes in and actually I look at it, that probably sits primarily more with another discipline than us, even though there's a bit of a historical kind of appeal, or even within the history discipline, I've got my area, my main areas of commissioning focus, initiative aside, if you like, for 1 second, are sort of European history, medieval history tends to be where I do most of my commissioning, whereas Maddie Holder, our senior commissioning editor, is kind of the global history editor, and she will kind of generally deal with things that have that kind of dimension to a book project more. So and our correspondingly our kind of field knowledge and so on kind of goes hand in hand with that. So you're better placed with that editor. So we always try to make sure that a book sits with the right editor on the academic side. I mean, where we sort of there is a bit of a disconnect, if you like, in terms of is the way in which we operate as an academic division and the way we assess projects versus the way our trade counterparts assess something. So, I mean, generally speaking, our trade team will only take solicited projects, so they'll only take things from agents. So, my advice would be if you're looking to reach that market, in a big way, and that's where you see, you want your writing to be placed is kind of for a wider, for a better phrase, mass market, readership. Then, getting an agent would be my advice. And and if you don't know where to start with that, I mean, I would suggest maybe trying the Writers and Artists Yearbook, which has a lot of helpful information in there about agents that are out there and active at the moment, and the kinds of material that they're looking to kind of represent as agents. So that would be kind of the best place to start with that.
Brilliant. And the vexed issue of images and who pays licensing and copyright, and are you averse to images?
We're not averse to images. I mean, as I say, it's I'll speak exclusively about, it's horses for courses with images, really, in terms of type of book and everything else. Like, I mean, what we do with, say, a textbook and what we're able to provide there in terms of financial support is different to a monograph. And one of the reasons for that is because, from a kind of commercial perspective, we don't ultimately feel like, and I don't think we're alone in this as an academic press, we don't have budget to spend on images for a monograph. And that's largely because we don't think that there's going to be much of a difference in sales regarding whether a book has no images, really, 5 images or 20 images. Now, I appreciate that for some books, there is clearly a value in having images if a book has a real kind of visual angle to it, if it's, sort of, so that's obviously a consideration. And so from a kind of having an aversion to it, we don't have an aversion, but we don't really have a mechanism as when it comes to monographs to offer financial support, with the expectation would be on you as the author to clear any necessary permissions and to provide high resolution versions of those images. We wouldn't procure them, and we wouldn't be able to kind of, obviously we can offer sort of informal support and in a sort of a collaborative fashion, which we always try to do as an editorial team at Bloomsbury. We try to be as nice as we can, and there are certain levers that we can sort of pull to help, in the sense that if you are committed to having images, like for instance, we have really good business-to-business deals with places like Getty Images and Alamy. We can get images at Getty for like £15 an image. We'd have to do that as a Bloomsbury employee with our account, so we would sort of make those acquisitions and then invoice you, say, if you wanted to include images. So we can kind of help in certain ways by getting you access to discounted images, is a kind of a small helping hand that we can offer. And I mean, that aside, if you're able to do that, and whether you have public domain images or you maybe have some grant money that you can spend on images and you really want to have images in there, black and white images integrated in the text for our books, I think, I mean, probably, this is really upper end, but I mean, we probably had books with like 50, 60 images in the past. I mean, we could certainly accommodate, for a 70, 80, 90,000 word book, we can easily accommodate 20, 30 images, black and white images, half page size in the book, as long as you've kind of done all the necessary legwork from a kind of a permissions and cost perspective.
Okay, I've got a question that I missed. Mikhail, at what stage is the contract signed?
So again, it's quite a streamlined process. Ultimately, and I'm trying to think exactly, if you're thinking about the initiative, we kind of get to a point where the initiative and the process that we work on internally, in any standard project that comes in, kind of come together. Then, once the panel have shortlisted, and then we have projects that we're looking, the shortlisted projects that we're looking to consider, you can kind of take that as the point when, if we're looking to consider something that's come in independently and we've decided that it's worthwhile for us to assess, we'd get peer review. We'd look to get sort of 1 in the case of the initiative, minimum 2 for something else, get that review feedback in. That usually takes about 6 or 7 weeks. We share that with the author typically. Assuming that the feedback is positive, and I feel like we're in a strong enough position to kind of present the project to the publishing board, I then look to take that to a publishing board monthly meeting, so probably expecting that to happen in the next kind of 4 or 5 weeks from wherever we are in the calendar. And I'll get a green light there and then, we get approval, hopefully. And then, I can come out, make a contract offer, contract be drafted and signed once we could kind of, agree on the particulars. So it's quite a sort of streamlined process and pretty transparent. So